So I'll turn it over to you, give your counter argument, and then I have a few questions for both of you, and then we'll probably open it up to the audience for some Q&A. Steve?
Thank you. I would say don't run down and put tinfoil on your head, and I would say that my esteemed colleague is not a tinfoil wearing person by any stretch of the imagination. While we might not agree on everything, he has my admiration because he's a man who believes in the principles for which he espouses and has lived by those principles to great personal sacrifice, frankly. And anybody who's willing to do that, in my book, is worth listening to. I looked at this argument in two ways. The question was, is the NSA violating your rights? And I threw in, just because I can't help myself, is Edward Snowden a hero? Before I answer those two questions, I have to tell you, coming from the Heritage Foundation, people generally expect us to go one way or another. The Heritage, and I'm the Defense and Homeland Security guy at Heritage, we care a great deal about security. We care about defense, all those things. We want to see our folks who have that responsibility have all the tools they need to do their jobs properly. But we also really care about the Constitution and our civil liberties and smaller government and all those other things that, frankly, have animated our organization since it started. So it's a tough task for us to deal with these problems. It's not as cut and dry as some people might think it is. So getting back to the thing, what's the answer to those two questions? For me, the answer to both of those is no. The NSA is not violating your rights, and no, Edward Snowden is not a hero. Mr. Snowden is a person who broke the law, violated numerous agreements and oaths to which he swore, and if we're to understand the things he has said, he knew before he took the oaths that he was going to violate them. He did it willfully. It wasn't like he got in the job, saw something, and changed his mind. He went into it with that in mind. So in my opinion, he deliberately plotted against this country. He stole well over 1 million documents, which frankly, having had my last job with IBM to review documents for the Intel community to try and give them grades by looking at all the briefings and papers and all the stuff they read, there's no way on God's green earth that Mr. Snowden read every one of those documents that he stole before he gave them to people who had no authority to read them. He just scooped them all up and dumped them out there. And so, it wasn't that he found something and said, oh my gosh, here it is, I've gone over the edge and now I'm going to take this action. I also throw out that the main journalist involved, Glenn Gruden, who I had the pleasure to do a show with the week of the first release of the Snowden papers. We were talking and I made a comment about the government, which I'll elaborate on in a second, but his answer was, well, the entire government is flawed. It's all corrupt. They all need to go. So I said, well, Glenn, you're saying, like both parties, all three branches of government, all of them, they are all totally corrupt. They all need to be driven out. I said, so because I couldn't believe he was saying this. I said, so you're saying the entire U.S. constitutional system needs to be replaced? Absolutely. It is irreparable. I was a little at a loss to discuss it with him after that. He never really gave me an alternative to it, but that was his position. So I would say Glenn, unfortunately, had sort of gone beyond being a journalist at that point, and he was a political activist with an agenda. And I think some of the order that some of these things have been rolled out will tell you that. Okay, so that's my rant on Snowden. The NSA is not a rogue organization. All right, it is a spy agency. European political theatrics and false indignation aside, every modern nation today spies. They do it, some do it well, some do it poorly. To use the same quotation that Ladar mentioned of Henry Stimson, which he made when he was the Secretary of State, he sort of changed his mind when he became the Secretary of War during World War II, because he kind of helped lay the foundations for all these organizations that we later used for espionage. So, you know, you have to keep in mind that every country needs to have that capability. Some of us do it better than others. There's only two of the Snowden revelations that really warrant discussion here. There's been a whole bunch of others, but the two main ones are the Telephony Metadata program, the so-called 205 program, which looked at landline telephone calls. I didn't know this until well after the fact. They did not collect on cell phones. So all of you who don't have landlines, you have another good reason for not having one. They did it just on landlines. In fact, they were thinking of dropping the program because of it. The take they were getting was getting lower and lower because more and more people aren't using landlines anymore. And the PRISM program, the so-called 715, I'll start with that. PRISM is a legitimate, internationally focused intelligence gathering program. It was focused on foreign targets, specific foreign targets. It was never walk up to Google and Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and attach a big hose to it and suck everything out. They didn't read every email that was out there. They didn't read every tweet that everyone has written. God help them if they ever tried that. That's a false characterization of that program. They were targeted. They went to the FISA court, got permission to go after specific foreign targets, and collected the data on those. Yes, some of those companies willingly assisted with that when they went to them with a warrant. Not every company is quite like Ladar, where they came to him with a warrant and he said, sorry, I'm not giving you the stuff. I'll go out of business first. I'm not going to do that. Most companies don't. Most companies say, all right, you got a legitimate legal warrant. I'm going to comply because that's the law. And they did. Spying on foreigners is legitimate. It's absolutely needed today, and it's naively foolish to think that we don't need a robust international intel capability. Even if you are rabidly isolationist and completely against us having any foreign engagements or interventions anywhere, you'd be kind of foolish not to want to know what the rest of the world was doing, even while you're standing behind your isolationist walls. You need to, even if you don't want to have a military, you still need to have an intelligence capability. And nothing in the prison program violated your rights as American citizens. And I'll throw out the concept that the president even mentioned, that we owe the world the exact same protections and rights that we give American citizens is a ludicrous concept. We don't owe the world. No other country in the world gives foreign nationals the same protections they give their own citizens. Why in the world should we? I don't understand that one. 205, the bulk collection and retention of telephony metadata does raise a lot of concerns. It raises it for us. It should raise it for any American, because my colleague is correct. The NSA's mission is to collect foreign intelligence. It also has a protective mission of protecting our networks from foreigners. They wear two hats. They're an intelligence organization and a military organization, both. And this 205 program kind of got off in the weeds, I think. The determination, well, let's start with some facts first. The determination that metadata wasn't protected, metadata being, who called, when they called, who did they call to, not by name, but by numbers. That the determination that was not protected and did not require a warrant for them to take was not made by the NSA, it was made by the courts. It's based on established case law having to do with envelopes. All right? Your return address, the address that you're sending it to, and the fact that the envelope's in the system is not protected. They don't need a warrant to get that. It's public information. You have no expectation of privacy of that information on the outside of the envelope. That was the reasoning that they used to determine that the telephony metadata could be collected. Frankly, it was collected out of an efficiency measure. It wasn't done so they could get into your knickers and find out everything that was going on. The telephone companies only keep the data for anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half for business purposes. The NSA said, you know, it would be really helpful. We could do a much better job of analysis if we had 5 years worth. But they didn't want to tell the companies, well, you guys have to keep it for 5 years because that's really expensive. So they said, well, can we keep it? And they said, because it wasn't protected data, they said, sure, go ahead. The other aspect was each of those telephone companies keep it in different formats. So when you're starting to do the analysis, it's a pain in the neck because Verizon does it one way and AT&T does it another and Sprint does it a third. So it takes you longer to do the analysis. They thought this would be faster. Seems pretty reasonable. So I have to tell you, this was an attempt by two very different administrations. You know, President Bush was not the same as President Obama in hardly any of his views. Multiple different Congresses with leadership trading hands in the different houses, the entire federal judiciary, and they, I believe, tried to do an attempt to split the difference and balance their responsibility to protect our physical well-being from attack and protect our civil liberties and constitutional rights. This should not be conflated with the IRS scandal, all right, with the DOJ surveillance of journalists, with some of the things that have been mentioned, the FBI in the 50s and 60s, the Nixon White House, all that. I'm going to read you real quickly a quotation by Dr. Jeff Stone, who was on the President's Commission to make recommendations for adjusting the programs. And Dr. Stone is a major player in the ACLU. He's on their National Advisory Council. He is a pretty strong civil liberties kind of guy and not a big fan of the NSA. And after all of the investigations that he did about the NSA, and at the end of it, he still decided the bulk collection was a bad idea and was wrong, but he said this: not only did I find out that the NSA had helped thwart numerous terrorist plots against the United States and its allies in the years since 9/11, I also found out that it is an organization that operates with a high degree of integrity and a deep commitment to the rule of law. I won't read the rest of it, but I have to tell you, having worked with the NSA as a non-NSA guy, they're pretty obsessive people. You know, the CIA, they can get a little freelancy, wiggle around, a lot of imagination. The NSA are all engineers. They don't like breaking rules. Now, you can make the argument that the rules they were given were not the correct ones, but the NSA was not running rogue. Okay, that said, even though, in my opinion, what the 205 program did was not illegal, was not unconstitutional, bottom line was a lot of people are hugely uncomfortable with the idea of a government organization scooping up all this data and holding it for a long period of time. But there was no findings at all that the NSA did anything illegal with it, that they broke any of their rules. There were a couple of instances where for a day or so somebody got out of the lines, and the reason we know that is because there were briefings that they took to their leaders and said, hey, on Thursday we went out of the lines, we collected this, here's how we purged it, here's the steps we're taking to make sure we don't get out of that line again, and here's what we did to the people who made this mistake, which were released by Mr. Snowden in some of his releases. The bottom line is that people were uncomfortable with what might be done with this information, not what was done with it. Bottom line, the bulk collection and retention of this data is going to end. I don't think anybody doubts that. The President's recommendation was ended. The House Intel Committee's recommendation is ended. They looked at it and they said, you know, the 5-year thing, we can live without that. The different formats that slows us down a little bit, we can live without getting it all in one format. So I believe what you're going to end up seeing is that they're going to tell the companies that they're going to keep the data. They won't give them direction of how long. And they will still be able to go to a court episodically with specific legal documentation that they have a reason to know Steve Bucci's information. If Steve Bucci turns out to be a U.S. national, they will bring the FBI into it, because for U.S. people, that's their thing. If it's a foreign national, the NSA will continue with that warrant to get that information from the phone companies and to work it. There is one other option, to have a third party hold it. That's kind of a silly idea, but I'll talk about that in Q&A if you want. Frankly, the ACLU has weighed in and said they are comfortable with this plan. There's a couple other aspects of the two programs, but the main thing is end the bulk collection and retention and only do it through specific warrants. And I'll stop with this. Look, Snowden, if he'd only released the thing on the 205 program, the telephone metadata, he might have been a whistleblower. Even if he had done 205 and 715, which really didn't turn out to be anything, maybe he's still a whistleblower. A little debatable. But the fact that he stole over 1 million documents and dumped them without any sort of vetting, that's not whistleblowing. That's espionage. He is the biggest, most egregious espionage perpetrator in our company's history. If you count volume, he exceeded Bradley Manning, who only took about 70,000 documents, and most of his were secret, not top secret. And I have to tell you, the fact that Mr. Snowden ended up in Russia, not exactly a beacon of civil liberties and individual rights, something that Walter Pincus talks about in today's Washington Post. Heritage guys love quoting the Washington Post, by the way. It's kind of fun, because we don't do it very often. Where he didn't bother to call Mr. Putin on his little television discussion on what the Russians do for their people, because it's far more intrusive than anything we have ever thought about doing here. He is not a hero. He should be prosecuted. His actions revealed no criminal behavior that has been pointed to or had action taken on. Just because you don't like something the government does, it doesn't mean it's unconstitutional that your rights are being violated. We are having this debate. I think the systems will change, as I mentioned, but no, the NSA is not violating your rights, and we need to kind of calm down a little bit and discuss it reasonably, and not with some of the cartoonish ways of describing it. I'm not characterizing anything that was said here as that. I've had lots of discussions with lots of people, some in my own organization, who frankly don't want to get beyond the cartoon. And we need to do that, because we do have a responsibility to protect this nation as well as protect our rights.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to give Ladar 2 minutes to sort of respond